Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Whether you're listening with headphones, lying in bed, driving late at night, or just trying to relax, you're not alone here. If you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, when you're ready, let's begin with the first story. I went to Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park in late October because I wanted silence. Not the kind of quiet you get in a suburb at 3 in the morning, but real silence. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. I'd been dealing with a rough breakup and some work stress, and a friend suggested I take a few days off the grid. He said the redwoods would clear my head. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The parking area near the trailhead was empty except for one other car, a green Subaru with Oregon plates. I didn't see anyone around it. The air smelled like wet earth and something faintly sweet, maybe from the sorrel growing along the trail. The fog was already starting to roll in, even though it was only 3 o'clock. I had a permit for a backcountry site about 6 miles in. The trail wasn't difficult, mostly flat with some gradual elevation changes, but the trees made everything feel different. I'd seen redwoods before, on day trips, but being alone among them for hours was something else. The trunks were so wide that 3 or 4 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. Some of them had burn scars at the base, black and hollow, but still alive. The canopy was so high above me that I had to crane my neck to see where the branches started. The silence started about 2 miles in. At first there were birds. Jays, I think. Then nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt and the occasional creak of a branch somewhere far above. The fog thickened as I walked, turning the forest into a series of gray curtains. I could see maybe 30 feet ahead at any given time. The trees just appeared out of the mist, one after another, like they were being placed there as I moved forward. I reached my campsite a little after 5. It was a small clearing with a fire ring and a bear box. There was a wooden post with the site number burned into it, Site 14. I set up my tent, filtered some water from a nearby creek, and made a simple dinner on my camp stove. The fog was so thick by then that I couldn't see the trees on the other side of the clearing. It felt like I was sitting in a small room with no walls. As the light faded, I noticed something. There were boot prints in the dirt near the fire ring. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and they circled the fire ring twice before heading off into the woods to the north. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. The prints looked recent. The edges were still sharp, not softened by wind or moisture. I told myself it was probably a ranger doing a site check, or maybe someone who'd camped here the night before. But the permit system was pretty strict. Only 1 group per site per night. I checked my permit again. It clearly said I was the only one assigned to Site 14 for the next 3 nights. I sat by the fire ring for a while, not lighting a fire, just listening. The silence was heavier now. It didn't feel empty. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I kept expecting to hear something, an animal moving through the underbrush, a branch snapping, anything. But there was nothing. Around 9, I crawled into my tent. I didn't zip the rainfly all the way, just enough to keep the moisture out. I wanted to be able to hear if anything approached. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark fabric above me. My mind kept going back to those boot prints. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like someone walking, but not quite. It was too slow, too deliberate. Each step seemed to land after a pause that was just a little too long. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. The steps were coming from somewhere to the north, the same direction the boot prints had gone. They were faint, muffled by the fog and the damp ground, but they were definitely getting closer. I tried to count the interval between each step, 4 seconds, then 5, then 3. There was no pattern. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could and reached for my headlamp. I didn't turn it on. I just held it, my thumb on the button. The steps stopped. I held my breath. 10 seconds passed. 20. Then they started again, this time from a different direction. East, maybe? It was hard to tell. Sound moved strangely in the fog. I thought about calling out, asking if someone was there, but something stopped me. It didn't feel like the right thing to do. The steps didn't sound like someone lost or looking for help. They sounded methodical, like someone was walking a perimeter. After a few minutes, the steps faded. I waited another half hour, lying perfectly still, before I finally relaxed enough to close my eyes. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A branch creaking. The wind, maybe, or maybe not wind at all. I woke up just before dawn. The fog was still thick, but there was enough light to see the clearing. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire ring looked the same. The bear box was still closed, but there were new boot prints. They circled my tent. 3 complete loops, evenly spaced about 6 feet from the tent walls. The prints were identical to the ones I'd seen the night before. Same size, same tread pattern. I felt my stomach tighten. I walked around the tent slowly, examining the prints. They were fresh. The dirt was still slightly displaced along the edges, like they'd been made within the last few hours. Whoever had made them had been here while I was sleeping. I checked the surrounding area. There were no other prints leading to or from my site. It was like the person had appeared at the edge of the clearing, walked around my tent, and then vanished. I knew that wasn't possible. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I just missed the other prints. Maybe the fog was making it hard to see. I made coffee and tried to think it through. The rational part of my brain said it was probably a ranger. Maybe they'd seen my permit was active and wanted to make sure I was okay. But why wouldn't they knock on the tent? Why wouldn't they say something? And why walk in circles? I decided to hike out to the ranger station. It was about 4 miles back the way I'd come. I packed up my gear, left most of it in the bear box, and started walking. The trail looked different in the morning light. The fog had thinned a little, but it still clung to the ground in patches. The trees felt even larger, somehow, more imposing. About a mile in, I saw something that made me stop. There was a side trail I hadn't noticed on the way in. It wasn't marked on my map, just a narrow path disappearing into the trees. There were boot prints leading down it, the same boot prints. I stood there for a long time, staring down that trail. I don't know what made me follow it. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to understand what was happening. I told myself I'd just walk a little way, see where it went. The trail wound between the trees, narrow and uneven. It didn't feel like an official trail, more like a game path or something a person had made over time. The prints were clear in the soft dirt. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened into another clearing, smaller than mine. There was no fire ring, no bear box, no site marker, but there was a tent. It was old. The fabric was faded and patched in several places. It was set up under a massive redwood, tucked against the trunk like it was trying to hide. The tent was zipped shut. There was no sound coming from inside. I stood at the edge of the clearing, not sure what to do. The tent didn't look abandoned. There was a camp chair folded neatly beside it and a small tarp stretched between 2 trees, creating a covered area. Underneath the tarp were some supplies: a cooler, a water jug, a lantern. Everything was organized, almost obsessively so. The camp chair faced away from the tent, toward the trees. I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. I waited, listening. The silence pressed in around me. I took a few steps closer, my boots crunching on the fallen needles. I'm a camper from Site 14. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay. Still nothing. The tent didn't move. There was no rustling, no indication that anyone was inside. But I had the strong feeling I was being watched. Not from the tent, from somewhere in the trees. I circled the clearing slowly, keeping my distance from the tent. That's when I noticed the marks on the redwood trunk behind the tent. They were carved into the bark, shallow and rough. Tally marks. I counted them. 47 groups of 5, 235 days. Below the tally marks was a single word, carved deeper: waiting. My hands started to shake. I backed away from the tree, my eyes moving between the tent and the surrounding forest. The fog seemed thicker here, almost deliberately so. I couldn't see more than 20 feet into the trees in any direction. I should have left then. Every instinct told me to turn around and get back to the main trail. But I needed to know if someone was in that tent, if someone needed help. I approached the front slowly, my heart hammering. I'm going to open the tent. If you're in there, please say something. Silence. I reached for the zipper. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I pulled it down slowly. The sound was impossibly loud. I opened the flap and looked inside. The tent was empty, but it had been occupied recently. There was a sleeping bag laid out neatly, a pillow at one end. A small battery-powered lantern sat in the corner, turned off. There were books stacked along one side. I recognized a few titles. Field guides, mostly. Local flora and fauna. But there were also journals. 5 of them, spiral-bound, with dates written on the covers in marker. I picked up the most recent one. The date on the cover was from 2 weeks ago. I opened it. The handwriting was small and precise, almost mechanical. The first entry was dated 8 months prior. Day 1. I heard it again last night, closer this time. The pattern is becoming clear. It walks the same route every 3 days. I need to understand what it wants. I flipped through the pages. The entries were similar. Short observations about sounds, movements, patterns. The writer was tracking something, or thought they were. The tone started off clinical, almost scientific. But as I moved through the journal, the handwriting became less neat, the sentences shorter, more fragmented. Day 89. It knows I'm watching. It changed its route, came within 10 feet of my tent, stood there for an hour. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Day 134, found 3 more clearings, all empty. But the fire rings are fresh. Someone else is out here, or something is pretending. Day 198, the ranger came by, told me I had to leave. Permit expired. I told him I couldn't. He didn't understand. He said he'd be back with the sheriff. That was 6 days ago. No one came. I stopped reading. My mouth was dry. I looked around the tent again. Everything was too neat, too organized, like someone who'd been living here for months and had perfected their routine. But where were they now? I put the journal back and backed out of the tent. As I stood up, I noticed something I'd missed before. Another set of boot prints leading away from the camp. But these were different. Barefoot prints. Human, but wrong somehow. The toes were too spread out. The weight distribution was off. They led into the trees to the west. I didn't follow them. I turned and walked back to the main trail as fast as I could without running. My mind was racing. Someone had been living out here off permit for months. They'd been tracking something, or they thought they were. And now they were gone. I made it back to the ranger station just before noon. It was a small building near the main parking area, with a covered porch and a couple of wooden benches outside. There was a ranger truck parked in front. I practically ran up the steps and pushed through the door. A woman looked up from behind the desk. She was in her 50s maybe, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her name tag said, Ellison. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile faded when she got a good look at my face. "You okay?" she asked. I told her everything. The boot prints around my tent, the unmarked trail, the camp with the journals, the tally marks. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I went on. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet. She pulled out a folder and opened it on the desk. Inside were several printed reports and a photo. The photo showed a man in his 40s, thin, with a dense beard and hollow eyes. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a knit cap. He looked exhausted. "That's Marcus Levitt," Ellison said. "He had a permit for Site 22 back in March. 3 nights. He never checked out. We found his car in the lot 2 weeks after his permit expired. We searched for him, sent teams out for 5 days, never found him or his camp. I found his camp, I said. She nodded slowly. We'll need you to show us where. I agreed. Ellison radioed for another ranger, a younger guy named Torres. The three of us drove back to the trailhead and hiked out to my site. From there, I led them down the unmarked trail to the clearing. It took longer than I remembered. The trail seemed to twist more, and the fog had rolled in again, making it hard to see. When we reached the clearing, the tent was gone. Everything was gone. The tarp, the camp chair, the supplies. The only thing left was the redwood tree with the tally marks. Ellison walked over to it and ran her hand over the carved words. "This is fresh," she said. "These were made recently." Torres searched the area, looking for any sign of where the camp had been. He found a few impressions in the dirt where the tent stakes might have been, but that was it. No boot prints, no barefoot prints. Nothing. "Are you sure this is the right clearing?" Ellison asked me. I looked around. It was the same tree, same size, same location. The tally marks were right there. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." We searched for another hour, widening our circle, but found nothing. Eventually, Ellison said we should head back. On the walk back to the ranger station, she told me they'd keep looking. She took my contact information and said someone would follow up. I left the park that afternoon. I didn't stay for the second night. I couldn't. As I drove away, I kept thinking about that journal. About Marcus Levitt spending 8 months in the woods tracking something that might not have existed. Or worse, tracking something that did. I got a call from Ellison 3 weeks later. She said they'd sent another team out. They'd searched the area thoroughly, using dogs and GPS. They'd found no trace of Marcus or his camp. But they did find something else. Site 14, my site, had been decommissioned. She said there'd been a series of incidents over the years. Campers reporting strange sounds, boot prints, feelings of being watched. The Park Service had decided it was better to close it. She didn't say what the incidents were. I didn't ask. I haven't been back to Prairie Creek. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those boot prints circling my tent. I think about Marcus carving tally marks into that tree, counting the days, waiting for something. I wonder if he's still out there. I wonder if he found what he was looking for. Or if it found him. The redwoods are ancient. They've been standing for thousands of years. They've seen things we can't imagine. And in all that time, in all that silence, maybe something else learned to live among them. Something that knows how to wait. My brother Chris and I planned the trip in early November. We'd been talking about doing a backpacking loop in the Lost Coast area for years, and we finally had the time lined up. Chris had just finished a contract job in Sacramento, and I'd taken a week off from teaching. The weather forecast looked decent. Cold, but no rain expected. We drove up on a Sunday morning and started the trail around noon. The loop was supposed to be about 25 miles over 3 days. Not difficult, but remote. The trail followed the coast for the first section, then cut inland through old-growth redwood forest before looping back to the trailhead. We'd both done plenty of backpacking before. This wasn't our first trip, but it was our first time in this particular area. The coastal section was beautiful. Rocky cliffs, gray sand beaches, waves crashing against the shore. We made good time and reached our first campsite by late afternoon. It was a small clearing just off the beach, sheltered by a low ridge. We set up our tents, filtered water from a creek, and made dinner as the sun set over the ocean. That night, we sat on a piece of driftwood and watched the stars come out. The Milky Way was visible, a bright band across the sky. Chris pointed out constellations. He'd always been better at that than me. We talked about work, about family, about nothing important. It was exactly the kind of trip we'd needed. The next morning we broke camp and started the inland section. The trail left the coast and climbed gradually into the hills. Within an hour we were surrounded by redwoods. The transition was startling. One moment we were in open coastal scrub, the next we were in deep forest. The temperature dropped, the light changed, everything became softer, quieter. The trail was well maintained but narrow. In some places it was just a line of dirt between massive tree trunks. We had to walk single file. Chris was ahead of me, setting the pace. We didn't talk much. The forest seemed to discourage conversation. Every sound we made felt too loud. Around midday, we stopped for lunch at a small clearing. There was a fallen redwood across one side, creating a natural bench. We sat on it and ate granola bars and dried fruit. Chris checked the map. We were making good time. The next campsite was about 6 miles ahead. We'd get there with plenty of daylight to spare. As we were packing up, I noticed something carved into the fallen log we'd been sitting on. Initials. A.R. Pa M.L. with a heart around them. Below that, a date. 1987. I pointed it out to Chris. "That's a long time ago," he said. I ran my hand over the carving. It was deep, weathered by decades of moisture and decay. I wondered who A.R. and M.L. were, if they were still together, if they ever came back here. We kept walking. The trail wound through the forest, crossing small streams on wooden footbridges. Some of the bridges were old, the wood soft and green with moss. They creaked under our weight. Chris went across first each time, testing them. He was always the more cautious one. About 2 miles from the campsite, we came across something strange. There was a tree on the left side of the trail with a piece of orange flagging tape tied to one of the lower branches, the kind surveyors use. But there was no indication of any survey work. No other markers, no disturbed ground, just the one piece of tape. Chris shrugged. Probably some trail maintenance thing. We kept going. A quarter mile later, there was another piece of tape. Same tree height, same type, then another, and another. They appeared every few hundred feet, always on the left side of the trail, always at the same height. "This is weird," I said. Chris stopped and looked at the most recent marker. "Maybe it's marking an alternate route?" But there was no alternate route. The trail continued straight. The markers just kept appearing, leading deeper into the forest. We followed them because they were following the trail. But I started to feel uneasy. The markers felt wrong somehow. The markers continued for about a mile. Then they stopped. We came around a bend and there were no more. I looked back. The last one was visible, tied to a branch about 50 yards behind us. Ahead, nothing. "That was strange," Chris said. We kept walking. The forest felt different after the markers stopped. Darker, maybe? Or maybe I was just on edge. The trail began to descend slightly, following the contour of a hillside. To our right, the ground dropped away into a ravine. To our left, the redwoods climbed up the slope, massive and silent. We were making good time when Chris stopped suddenly. He held up his hand. I stopped behind him. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I did. A voice. Distant and faint, but definitely a voice. It sounded like someone calling out. Not words, exactly. Just a sound. A yell, maybe. Or a shout. "Someone might be hurt," Chris said. We stood there, listening. The voice came again, was coming from up the slope, somewhere off the trail. Chris looked at me. "We should check it out." I didn't want to. Something about the voice felt off. But Chris was already taking off his pack. "We'll leave our stuff here. Just go see if someone needs help." We started up the slope. The ground was steep and covered in fallen needles, making it slippery. We had to grab onto ferns and small trees to pull ourselves up. The voice kept calling, always just ahead, always out of sight. We climbed for about 10 minutes. The voice seemed to be getting closer. Then it stopped. We stood there, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. Chris called out. "Hello? Do you need help?" No response. Just the silence of the forest. We looked at each other. "Maybe they moved," I said. We climbed a little higher. The slope leveled out into a small plateau. And that's where we found it. A camp, but not like any camp I'd ever seen. There were 3 tents set up in a triangle. They were old and weathered. The fabric sun-faded and torn in places. One of them had collapsed partially, the poles bent, but the other 2 were still upright, their doors unzipped and open. Around the tents were various items: camp chairs, coolers, a portable stove. Everything was rusted or covered in mold. This camp had been here for a long time. Chris walked over to one of the tents and looked inside. Empty. I checked the other one. Also empty, but there were sleeping bags inside, still laid out. Personal items. A water bottle, a flashlight, a pair of boots. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "Why would someone just leave all this stuff?" Chris was examining the camp chairs. They were arranged in a circle around a fire pit. But the fire pit looked wrong. It wasn't a normal ring of stones. It was a perfect circle, dug into the ground about 3 feet across. And inside the circle there were no ashes, just bare dirt. "Chris," I said, "we should go." He nodded. "Yeah." As we turned to leave, I saw something that made me freeze. There were orange markers here too. They were tied to trees all around the camp, forming a perimeter. At least 20 of them, all at the same height, all facing inward. We scrambled back down the slope as fast as we could. When we reached the trail, we grabbed our packs and started walking. Neither of us said anything. We just wanted to put distance between us and that camp. We reached our designated campsite about an hour later. It was getting dark. The site was small, with space for 2 tents and a bear box. We set up quickly, not talking much. Chris made dinner while I filtered water. We ate in silence. After dinner, Chris finally spoke. That camp was old. Years old, probably. Whatever happened there, it happened a long time ago. I wanted to believe him, but I kept thinking about those markers, and about the voice we'd heard. It hadn't sounded distressed. It had sounded like it was calling us. We went to bed early. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and lay there, listening. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just silence. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. It was still dark. I lay there trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Outside my tent. Slow and deliberate. I held my breath. The footsteps circled my tent. Once, twice. Then they stopped at the front. I could see a shadow through the fabric. Someone was standing right outside. I waited for them to say something. To knock. To do anything. But they just stood there. I don't know how long they stood there. It felt like hours. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it. I kept my eyes fixed on the shadow, waiting for it to move. Finally, it did. The shadow shifted, and the footsteps started again, moving away from my tent. They crossed the clearing slowly, then faded into the distance. I lay there for a long time before I got the courage to move. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and looked outside. The clearing was empty. The moon was up, casting pale light through the trees. I could see Chris's tent across from mine. It looked undisturbed. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw them. Footprints in the soft dirt. They circled my tent completely, then led across the clearing to Chris's tent. They circled his tent too. Then they led off into the forest to the north. I got out of my tent and walked over to Chris's. "Chris," I whispered, "you awake?" No answer. I unzipped his tent. He was asleep, his sleeping bag pulled up to his chin. I shook his shoulder. He woke up with a start. "What's wrong?" "Someone was here," I said. "They circled both our tents." Chris sat up and grabbed his headlamp. We both stepped outside. I showed him the footprints. He followed them with his light, his face tense. When he reached the point where they disappeared into the trees, he stopped. "We need to leave," he said. "It's the middle of the night." "I don't care. We're packing up and getting out of here." We broke camp in the dark. It took us about 30 minutes. We didn't bother being quiet or organized. We just stuffed everything into our packs and started walking. Chris had a GPS unit with a downloaded map. We followed the trail using our headlamps, moving as fast as we could. The trail seemed different at night. The trees looked larger, more imposing. The shadows moved in ways that made me jumpy. Every sound made me want to run. But we kept a steady pace, Chris in the lead. About 2 miles in, we came across more markers. Orange flagging tape, just like before. But these weren't on the left side of the trail. They were on both sides. And they were everywhere. Dozens of them, tied to branches at varying heights. Some were just a few feet off the ground. Others were high up, almost out of sight. "What the hell is this?" Chris said. We kept walking. The markers became denser. Every tree seemed to have one. It was disorienting. The orange tape glowed in our headlamp beams, creating a maze of reflections. I felt like we were walking through a tunnel of markers. Then Chris stopped. "Look." Ahead of us, the trail split. But it wasn't a marked intersection. It was just a fork. 2 paths leading in different directions. Neither one looked more traveled than the other. And both were lined with orange markers. "Which way?" I asked. Chris checked his GPS. "Neither of these should be here. The map shows the trail going straight." We stood there, staring at the 2 paths. The markers seemed to pulse in our headlamp beams. I felt a wave of dizziness. Let's just pick one. But what if it's the wrong one? Then we turn around. We took the left path. It wound between the trees, climbing slightly. The markers continued, but they started to thin out. After about 10 minutes, the path opened into a clearing, and in the center of the clearing was another camp. It looked exactly like the one we'd found earlier. 3 tents in a triangle, camp chairs in a circle around a bare fire pit. But this camp looked newer. The tents were in better condition, and there were fresh supplies. A cooler with food in it, a lantern hanging from a tree branch. The lantern was on, casting a yellow glow across the clearing. "Someone's here," Chris whispered. We backed away slowly. That's when we heard it, a voice. The same voice from earlier, but this time it was close. It was coming from inside one of the tents. It wasn't calling anymore, it was laughing. Quietly at first, then louder. a low, rhythmic laugh that didn't sound quite right. The pitch was off. The timing was wrong. We ran. We didn't discuss it. We just turned and ran back the way we'd come. My pack bounced against my back. Branches whipped at my face. I could hear Chris ahead of me, crashing through the underbrush. We reached the fork and took the other path this time. It descended sharply. We half ran, half slid down the slope, using trees to slow ourselves. My lungs burned. My legs ached. But I didn't stop. The path finally leveled out and rejoined the main trail. We knew it was the main trail because the markers were gone. It was just dirt and trees. Normal. Chris checked his GPS. We were still 3 miles from the trailhead. We walked fast. Neither of us spoke. The sky was starting to lighten. Dawn was coming. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was up. Chris's truck was where we'd left it, covered in dew. We threw our packs in the back and got in. Chris started the engine and we drove. We didn't stop until we were out of the forest, back on the main highway. He pulled into a gas station and we sat there for a while, not saying anything. Finally, I spoke. "What was that?" Chris shook his head. "I don't know." We bought coffee and sat on the curb outside the gas station. The morning was bright and warm. Cars passed on the highway. Everything felt normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just escaped something. "Those camps," Chris said. "Someone's maintaining them." "But why? Why would someone set up fake camps in the middle of the woods?" "Maybe they're not fake. Maybe people have been going up there and just leaving their stuff. That doesn't explain the voice, or the footprints around our tents." Chris didn't have an answer for that. We finished our coffee and drove home. The whole trip back, I kept thinking about those orange markers, about the camps, about the laugh we'd heard from inside that tent. A week later, I tried to find information about the area we'd been in. I searched online for reports of missing hikers, strange incidents, anything. I found one article from 6 years ago. A couple had gone missing on that exact trail. Their car was found at the trailhead. They'd registered for a 3-day backpacking trip. They never returned. Search teams had looked for them for 2 weeks. They'd found no trace, no camps, no gear, nothing. The article mentioned that the woman's sister had received a voicemail during the time they were supposed to be on the trail. The voicemail was mostly static, but there were voices in the background. The sister said it sounded like her sister and the boyfriend, but they were laughing. Not like they were having fun. She said it sounded wrong. I showed the article to Chris. He read it and closed his laptop. "We're not going back there." "I know. But I can't stop thinking about it. About those markers leading off into the forest. About the camp set up like someone was expecting visitors. About that voice calling us up the slope. I wonder how many people have heard it. How many people followed it into the woods? I wonder if those camps are still there. If the markers are still multiplying. If someone or something is still tying them to trees in the darkness." The redwoods are a maze. Once you leave the trail, it's easy to get lost. The trees all look the same. The landmarks disappear in the fog. People go missing in forests like that every year. Most of them are found. but some aren't. I think about the couple from the article, about the voicemail, about that laugh. I think about what might have been in those tents, what might have been watching us from the trees. Chris and I haven't been backpacking since. We talk about planning another trip sometimes, somewhere different, somewhere far from the redwoods. But we never follow through. I think we're both afraid of what we might find, or worse, what might find us. There's something in those woods. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's human. But it knows the forest better than we do. It knows how to use it. The markers, the camps, the voices, they're all tools, lures. And I think it's been doing this for a long time. I work as a wildlife biologist. My focus is on spotted owls, specifically their habitat use in old-growth forests. The job involves a lot of field work, long days hiking through remote areas, setting up recording equipment, checking nest sites. I've spent years in the redwoods. I know them well, or I thought I did. Last April, I was conducting surveys in the Jedediah Smith Redwoods. It's one of the most pristine old-growth forests left in California. The trees there are massive. Some of them are over 2,000 years old. It's the kind of place that feels ancient, untouched. I was working alone, which wasn't unusual. Most of my colleagues prefer to work in teams, but I've always been comfortable solo. I know how to navigate, how to handle equipment failures, how to stay safe. I've never had any problems. The survey area was about 8 miles from the nearest road. I hike in, spend 3 or 4 days setting up equipment and collecting data, then hike out. This particular trip was supposed to be routine. I had 6 recording stations to set up and 12 nest sites to check. I arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning. The sky was overcast, typical for April in the coastal redwoods. The air was cool and damp. I signed the trail register, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The trail was in good condition. It followed an old logging road for the first few miles, then branched off onto a narrower path that wound through the forest. I made good time. By early afternoon, I'd reached my base camp location. It was a small flat area near a creek, sheltered by a fallen redwood. I'd used this spot on previous trips. It was quiet and out of the way. I set up my tent and organized my gear. Then I pulled out my survey maps. I'd marked the locations of the recording stations I needed to set up. The first 2 were relatively close, about a mile from camp. I decided to get them done before dark. The stations are simple devices, a weatherproof box containing a microphone and a digital recorder. I mount them to trees about 6 feet off the ground, usually in areas where owls are known to hunt. The recorders run continuously for several weeks, capturing all the nocturnal sounds. Later, I analyze the recordings, listening for owl calls and other indicators. I set up the first station without any issues. It was in a good location, a small clearing with several large snags where owls often perch. I tested the equipment, confirmed it was recording properly, and marked the location on my GPS. The second station was about half a mile away, deeper into the forest. The terrain was more rugged. I had to cross a steep slope covered in ferns and deadfall. By the time I reached the location, it was starting to get dark. I found a suitable tree and mounted the station. As I was testing the equipment, I heard something. A sound I didn't recognize. It was low and rhythmic, almost like a drum beat, but not quite. It had an organic quality, like something breathing. I stood still, listening. The sound came again. It seemed to be coming from somewhere uphill, maybe 100 yards away. I checked my watch. It was almost 7. I needed to get back to camp before full dark. but curiosity got the better of me. I'm a scientist. I investigate things. I started walking uphill, toward the sound. The slope was steep and the light was fading fast. I used my headlamp, sweeping it back and forth across the ground. The sound continued, steady and unchanging. After about 5 minutes, I reached the source. It was a tree, a massive redwood, even larger than the ones around it, and the sound was coming from inside the trunk. There was a hollow at the base, a burned-out cavity that went deep into the tree. The sound echoed out of it, low and resonant. I knelt down and shone my light into the hollow. The cavity was huge. I could see at least 10 feet in before the light faded. The walls were charred black, smooth from fire and time, and deep inside, something was moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear, but the movement was wrong. I backed away from the tree slowly. My mind was trying to process what I'd seen. The movement had been rhythmic, almost mechanical, but there was nothing mechanical about it. It was organic, alive. The sound stopped. I stood there in the silence, my headlamp pointed at the hollow. Nothing moved. I waited for a full minute, then 2. Finally, I turned and started back toward camp. I didn't run. I told myself there was no reason to run, but I walked fast, faster than was probably safe on that slope in the dark. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. I reached camp around 8. I made a quick dinner and crawled into my tent. I told myself it had been a bear, or maybe a porcupine, something harmless, but I couldn't shake the image of that movement deep in the hollow, the way it had responded to my light, like it was aware of me. I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside my tent made me tense. The creak, the wind, the occasional creak of a branch. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. They were faint, but they were definitely footsteps, slow and measured. They passed my tent, heading uphill. I waited for them to come back. They didn't. In the morning, I checked the area around my camp. There were tracks in the soft dirt near the creek. Boot prints. They were large, at least size 12. They came from the direction of the trail and led uphill, toward the tree with the hollow. I followed them for a short distance. They were fresh, made within the last few hours. I stood there, looking up the slope. Someone else was out here. That was fine. It wasn't uncommon to run into other hikers or researchers in these forests. But something about the tracks bothered me. They were too evenly spaced, too straight, like someone walking with a purpose. I went back to camp and consulted my survey maps. I had 4 more recording stations to set up and 8 more nest sites to check. All of them were within a 3-mile radius of my camp. I decided to work systematically, starting with the closest sites and moving outward. The day was overcast and cool. I worked efficiently, moving from site to site. Each recording station took about 20 minutes to set up. The nest sites took longer. I had to climb to reach some of them using rope and climbing gear. By late afternoon, I'd completed 5 of the 6 stations. The last one was located about 2 miles northeast of camp, in an area I hadn't surveyed before. According to my map, it was near an old fire break, a line cut through the forest decades ago to prevent wildfires from spreading. I reached the area just before sunset. The fire break was overgrown now, but it was still visible as a gap in the canopy. I followed it for about a 1/4 mile, looking for a good location to mount the station. That's when I found the structure. It wasn't a building. It was more like a shelter. Someone had built it using fallen branches and redwood bark, creating a lean-to against a large tree. It was well constructed, sturdy enough to have lasted through several winters. But it looked abandoned. The bark was weathered and mossy. Leaves and needles had piled up inside. I approached carefully. There was no indication anyone had been here recently. I looked inside the shelter. It was empty except for a few items: a rusted coffee can, a piece of rope, a tarp that had deteriorated into shreds. Then I noticed the tree behind the shelter. There were carvings on it, not initials or names, numbers, hundreds of them, carved into the bark in neat rows. They started at about waist height and went up as high as I could see. I tried to make sense of them. They seemed random at first. Then I realized they were coordinates: latitude and longitude. Each set of numbers was followed by a date. The dates ranged from 15 years ago to just 6 months ago. I pulled out my GPS and checked the most recent coordinates. They pointed to a location about a mile south of where I was standing. I stood there, trying to understand. Someone had been coming out here for years, recording locations. But why? What were they marking? The light was fading. I needed to set up my last recording station and get back to camp. I found a suitable tree about 100 yards from the shelter and mounted the equipment. As I was finishing, I heard that sound again. The low, rhythmic sound from the night before. It was closer this time. Much closer. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. I turned slowly, sweeping my headlamp across the forest. The sound surrounded me. It wasn't echoing. There were multiple sources. I grabbed my pack and started walking back toward camp. The sound followed me. It stayed just out of sight, moving through the trees. I picked up my pace. The sound matched it. When I walked faster, it moved faster. When I slowed down, it slowed down. I reached camp just as full darkness set in. The sound had faded about halfway back, disappearing as suddenly as it had started. I went into my tent and zipped it shut. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to eat something, to drink water, to go through the motions of a normal evening. But I couldn't stop listening. Around 9, I heard voices. They were distant and indistinct, like people having a conversation just out of earshot. I couldn't make out words, but I could tell there were at least 2 different voices. Maybe 3. They seemed to be moving around the perimeter of my camp, circling it. I grabbed my voice recorder, the same type I used for owl surveys, and turned it on. I wanted evidence, proof that I wasn't imagining this. The voices continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed was complete. No insects, no animals, nothing. I lay in my tent, recorder still running, and waited. Around midnight, the sound started again, that low, rhythmic sound. But this time it was right outside my tent. I could feel it as much as hear it, a vibration that seemed to pass through the ground. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound continued for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, it faded. By 2 in the morning, everything was quiet again. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, waiting for dawn. When the first light appeared, I packed up my tent and gear as quickly as I could. I was getting out. The survey wasn't finished, but I didn't care. Something was wrong out here. I needed to leave. I started back toward the trailhead. The forest looked different in the morning light. The trees seemed taller, more imposing. The shadows were deeper. I walked fast, checking my GPS frequently to make sure I was on the right path. About 2 miles in, I came across something that made me stop. There was a recording station mounted to a tree beside the trail. It looked exactly like the ones I'd been setting up. Same weatherproof box, same mounting hardware. But I hadn't placed one here. I approached it carefully. The box was locked, just like mine. But there was no identification label. I tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. I took photos of it with my phone, noting the location on my GPS. A quarter mile later, I found another one, then another. By the time I reached the trailhead, I'd counted 7 stations, all identical to mine, all in locations I hadn't marked on my survey map. When I got back to my office, I downloaded the audio from my recorder. The voices I'd heard were on the recording, but they were strange. When I slowed down the playback, I realized they weren't speaking any language I recognized. The patterns were wrong. The sounds were too uniform, too rhythmic. And underneath the voices, there was that sound. The low rhythmic sound from the hollow tree. It was constant, running through the entire recording like a bass line. I contacted the ranger service and told them about the stations I'd found. They said they'd send someone to check. A week later, they called me back. They'd searched the area. They hadn't found any recording stations except the ones I'd placed. I went back to the coordinates I'd found carved into that tree. I plotted them all on a map. They formed a pattern, a rough circle about 5 miles in diameter. My camp had been near the center. I started researching the area's history. I found records of logging operations from the early 1900s. Workers' camps, railroad lines, all the usual infrastructure. But there were also reports. Disappearances. Over a period of about 20 years, from 1910 to 1930, 17 workers vanished in that area. Search parties found no trace of any of them. The logging company eventually pulled out. The official reason was difficult terrain. But in the company's internal records, which I found in an archive, there were mentions of disturbances, workers refusing to go into certain areas, equipment failures, strange sounds at night. The record stopped in 1931. The area was absorbed into what would eventually become the state park system. For decades, it was largely untouched. Then researchers like me started going back in. I found one other record, a field report from a botanist who surveyed the area in 1975. Her notes were clinical, mostly describing vegetation and soil conditions, but in the margins she'd written something else. The trees are watching. I don't think we should be here. She never went back. When I tried to contact her, I learned she'd passed away in 2003. But her daughter still had her field journals. She agreed to let me look at them. The journals were detailed, full of scientific observations, but scattered throughout were other notes. References to sounds she couldn't identify. Feelings of being followed. Camps she'd found that weren't supposed to be there. In her last entry, dated 3 days before she left the area, she'd written, "I've been mapping the sounds. They're coming from inside the trees. Well, all of them. It's not one thing. It's many." I haven't been back to Jedediah Smith. My supervisor suggested I take some time off, maybe transition to a different project. I agreed. I'm working on marbled murrelet surveys now, mostly along the coast. I don't go into the deep forest anymore. But I think about it constantly, about those recording stations I found, about the coordinates carved into that tree, about the sound coming from the hollow. I've listened to my recordings hundreds of times, trying to identify what I heard. I've run them through analysis software, compared them to every known animal sound in the region. Nothing matches. The closest comparison I've found is a recording made by a researcher in Washington State in 1998. She was studying old-growth forest acoustics. She captured something similar. A low-frequency sound that seemed to emanate from inside the trees themselves. She published a paper about it, suggesting it might be some kind of resonance phenomenon caused by wind moving through hollow trunks. But her explanation doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain the voices. It doesn't explain why the sound moves. It doesn't explain the stations or the coordinates or the pattern. I've tried to find other researchers who've worked in that area. There aren't many. Most surveys are done from a distance now, using aerial surveys and remote sensing. The few people who have done ground surveys report the same things: equipment failures, strange sounds, a feeling of being watched. One researcher, a graduate student from Oregon, sent me his field notes from a survey he conducted 2 years ago. He'd been working in the same area where I'd camped. He described finding a shelter made of bark and branches. Inside, he'd found a journal. He sent me photos of it. The journal was water damaged and partially illegible, but I could make out some entries. They were written by someone who'd been living in the forest for months. The entries described a project. The person was trying to map the network. They believed the trees were communicating, that there was a pattern to the sounds. They were using coordinates to track it. The last entry was dated 8 months before the graduate student found the journal. It said, "I've been invited deeper. Tomorrow I go into the center. I think I'll finally understand." There was no indication of what happened to the person who wrote it. The graduate student reported the journal to the rangers. They searched the area but found nothing. I think about that botanist from 1975, about her note that the trees were watching, about her map of the sounds. I think about the logger who disappeared in the 1920s, about the coordinates carved into that tree, marking locations over 15 years. I think about that hollow tree and what was moving inside it, about the sound that followed me through the forest, about the voices circling my camp. The redwoods are old. They've been there longer than our language, longer than our civilization. They've stood through centuries of silence. And in that silence, maybe something else has been there too. Something that's learned to use the forest, to move through it, to call. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's physical or something else entirely, but I know it's there, and I know it's patient. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I can hear it. That low, rhythmic sound. It's faint, like it's coming from very far away, but it's there. And I know it's not just in my head, because I've recorded it. Even here, in my apartment in the city, my equipment picks it up. A low vibration that shouldn't be possible. I've stopped playing those recordings. I've stopped researching. I've stopped thinking about going back. Because I know now that some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things exist in the spaces we can't see, in the silences we can't explain. The redwoods stand in darkness for most of the day. Light barely reaches the forest floor. And in that darkness, in those thousands of years of silence, something has been listening. Learning. Waiting. I hope it stays there. I hope it never leaves the forest. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it already has. If it's been following those of us who went too deep, who heard too much, who mapped too much of its territory. I wonder if that's what the coordinates were for. Not to mark where it was, but to mark where it had been. To show its movement over time. 15 years of data points, drawing closer and closer to the edges of the forest, closer to the roads, closer to the towns. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it was just sounds echoing through hollow trees, just wind and water and the natural acoustics of ancient wood. But deep down, I know better. Some part of me knows what I heard, what I felt, what was moving through that forest, watching me from the darkness. And I know it's still there, waiting in the redwoods, calling out to anyone who goes deep enough, anyone who listens carefully enough, anyone who's willing to follow the sound into the center. I won't go back, but I know others will. Researchers, hikers, people looking for solitude. They'll hear it too, and some of them won't come back. They'll add their coordinates to whatever map is being kept. They'll become part of the pattern. The redwoods don't forget. They hold everything, and whatever lives inside them remembers too.